Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
We're diving into Linux for DevOps.
Oh, yeah.
I'm excited about this one
Uh,
because, it's something that everyone always talks about, like how much Linux do you actually need to know to
right.
do DevOps?
Yeah.
We're going to be going through this blog post called Mastering Linux for DevOps. How much is enough?
Okay.
And hopefully by the end of this, you'll feel pretty confident about, where to start with learning Linux and
Mhm.
what to focus on
Yeah.
and maybe even like what to skip.
Hmm.
One of the things I thought was really cool about this blog post is they had this whole section on building your own Linux system,
Oh, wow.
which
Wow.
sounds kind of intense, but also like really cool to be able to say,
Yeah.
I built my own Linux system.
Definitely. I think so. It's interesting that this blog post starts off really strong by saying that Linux is the heart of modern infrastructure.
The heart,
Huh.
the heart.
That's a pretty powerful statement. Like,
If you don't know Linux, you don't know DevOps or something.
yeah. Well, I think it kind of gets to that point that Linux is kind of like the underlying sort of foundation for a lot of the technologies
Yeah.
that we use in DevOps.
So can you give an example of why that is?
Yeah. Well, you think about things like containers, Kubernetes.
Yeah.
All of this is heavily dependent upon the Linux kernel.
Okay.
So, and if you look at how containerization works, it uses things like subgroups and namespaces,
Okay.
which come from Linux.
Oh, so those are like Linux specific features.
Yeah, they're features of the Linux kernel. So understanding that and understanding like how containers are using these features
Okay.
of the kernel to, manage resources and provide isolation,
Right.
I think is really important for people who are in DevOps.
So like in a practical sense, can you give me like a concrete example of like how that might manifest?
Yeah. So subgroups, for example, are used to like limit resources to a container.
Okay.
So you can think of it almost like budgeting, like different departments in an organization, right?
Okay.
You have your marketing department and your engineering department. You want to make sure that engineering doesn't spend all the money,
Right.
right? So you allocate
Okay.
them a certain amount of resources, and that's kind of what state groups are doing for containers.
So you're saying that by understanding how those state groups work in Linux, you can better understand
Exactly.
how they're being used in the container world.
Exactly. You understand how to set limits,
Yeah.
how to monitor resource usage,
Okay.
things like that. And then namespaces are really all about providing that kind of isolation
Okay.
so that one container can't see what another container is doing.
Right.
You almost think of it like, separate offices for different teams within an organization.
I like that analogy.
Yeah. So they can kind of work independently
Right.
without, interfering with each other.
So that's helpful for like day-to-day operations.
Definitely.
Service management, network configuration.
Yeah. And just troubleshooting. Like if something goes wrong, you'll have a better understanding of where to look and how to fix it.
So you're not just like blindly typing commands in and hoping for the best.
Yeah.
You actually like know what's going on under the hood.
Right.
Yeah.
And this blog post, goes on to lay out 6 core skill areas that can help you really gain that understanding of Linux for DevOps.
6 core skills.
6 core skills.
Okay, well, I think it's probably worth going through all 6 of those.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know, like what stands out to you as the most important of those 6 or like the most crucial?
I think a good place to start is scripting.
Okay, scripting.
Yeah.
So like Bash scripting, Python scripting, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you think about the big picture of DevOps, right?
Yeah.
It's all about automation.
Yeah,
And scripting is really what enables that automation.
that makes sense.
Yeah. So, the blog post specifically calls out Bash for kind of like everyday tasks.
Okay.
And then Python for maybe more like complex automation needs. But the point is, scripting helps you to streamline those repetitive processes and to free up your time to focus on more strategic work.
Right, so you're not like manually doing the same things over and over again.
Exactly.
You can just like write a script and have it do it for you.
Yeah, it's all about working smarter, not harder.
I like that.
Right.
Okay, so scripting is definitely on the list.
Definitely.
What about like the command line interface?
Oh, yeah. The CLI.
Is that like a core skill?
Absolutely. I think the command line can seem a little intimidating at first.
Yeah, I remember when I first started using the command line, I was like, what is this black screen with all this text?
Right.
It was terrifying.
But it's incredibly powerful once you get the hang of it.
Yeah.
And I think, a good way to think about the command line is you're kind of speaking directly to your computer.
Oh, okay.
You're telling it exactly what to do rather than kind of clicking around with the mouse.
So it's like learning the language of your computer.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like learning the secret language of your machine.
I like that.
And once you learn that language, you could do so much more.
Okay, so command line, definitely important.
Definitely.
What about things like system logs?
System logs are super important, especially in a DevOps role.
Okay.
They're kind of like your detective novel for your system.
Oh,
It
yeah.
gives you all these clues about what's going on behind the scenes.
So you're saying if you know how to read the logs, you can like troubleshoot problems better.
Exactly. You can troubleshoot issues. You can spot potential problems before they blow up. You can just generally understand how your systems are behaving.
Okay.
And that kind of ties into this broader skill of system administration.
Okay.
So managing users and permissions and processes.
So it's not just about knowing the commands, it's about knowing like how to manage the system.
Exactly. It's about like understanding the system as a whole,
Right.
how to keep it running smoothly and securely.
Okay. System administration, big one.
Yeah.
Networking basics. I imagine that's also pretty important.
Oh, networking is essential. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you give me an example of like a networking concept that would be helpful for a DevOps person to know?
Yeah. Think about configuring network interfaces,
Go ahead.
understanding DNS,
Mm-hmm.
working with firewalls, even.
Oh, okay.
All of that is part of the Linux toolkit for DevOps.
So you're not just like working on your own little computer, you have to know how to connect it to the rest of the world.
Exactly. You got to understand how it fits into the larger network infrastructure.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
What about file systems and storage? I feel like that's something that people maybe don't think about as much.
Yeah, it's one of those things that can be a little bit less glamorous,
Yeah.
maybe than some of the other topics, but it's super important.
Okay.
You got to know how to manage partitions, how to work with different file systems,
Okay.
how to make sure that your data is stored securely and efficiently.
Okay.
It's kind of like the foundation for everything else you got to do.
So file systems and storage, definitely not something to skip.
Not to skip,
Yep.
no.
All right. And then the last one I think you said was security essentials.
Yeah, security essentials.
What does that entail?
So it's more than just, setting a strong password.
Right.
It's about understanding things like secure shell,
Okay.
for remote access.
SSH.
SSH.
Yeah.
Yeah. Managing permissions, effectively understanding how process isolation works to contain potential threats.
Okay. So like really understanding how to secure your systems.
Exactly. Yeah, security is a big deal these days, and it's only going to become more important.
All right. So we've got our 6 core skill areas. We've got scripting. We've got the command line. We've got system logs and administration, networking file systems, and storage security essentials.
Yeah, those are the big ones.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, but it sounds like you really need to know all that stuff to be effective in DevOps.
Yeah, I would say that a solid understanding of all of those areas is going to make you a much more effective DevOps engineer.
Okay, so those are the skills. Now, I know a lot of people who are watching this are probably thinking about certifications.
Yeah.
Like, is that something that's worthwhile to get?
Yeah, so certifications can definitely be valuable.
Okay.
They're a good way to demonstrate to potential employers that you have like a solid grasp of the fundamentals.
Okay, cool. So, like, prove to someone that you actually know what you're talking about.
Exactly. And they can also be a good way to kind of structure your learning.
Okay.
Give you a roadmap of what to study.
So it's like a forcing function to, like, actually learn the stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so the blog mentions a couple of different certifications. It mentions the RHCSA, it mentions CompTIA Linux Plus, and it mentions the LFCS.
Right.
Can you kind of give me like a brief overview of each one and what makes them different?
Sure. Yeah. So the RHCSA, which stands for the Red Hat Certified System Administrator.
Okay.
That's a great place to start. I think
Okay.
It focuses on those core Linux administration skills
Okay.
that are going to be used in a lot of DevOps type scenarios.
Yeah.
So it's a good foundation to build on.
So that's a good, like, broad foundational certifications.
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. What about CompTIA Linux Plus?
So CompTIA Linux Plus is a little bit broader in the sense that it covers kind of like core Linux skills that are relevant across a variety of IT roles, not just DevOps. So,
Okay.
it's still a great option for building a solid foundation.
So it's kind of like more general Linux knowledge rather than specifically focused on DevOps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Got it. And then the LFCS, which is the Linux Foundation Certified System Administrator.
Okay.
That one is interesting because it takes a more practical, hands-on approach.
Oh, okay. So it's not so much about like the theory. It's about like, can you actually do the stuff?
Exactly. It's about demonstrating that you can apply your skills in real-world scenarios.
I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the LFCS.
Yeah.
Now, I know a lot of people who are interested in DevOps are also like looking at Kubernetes,
Yeah.
and there's a big certification for Kubernetes called the CKA.
Right. The Certified Kubernetes Administrator.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how does that like fit in with all this Linux stuff? Like,
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people struggle with.
yeah.
Do I go for the Linux certification or the Kubernetes certification?
Right.
And this blog post actually has some good advice on that. They say, prioritize Linux first.
Oh, okay.
Having that solid understanding of Linux is going to make it so much easier to learn and master Kubernetes later on.
So it's like a prerequisite almost.
Yeah, I think of it kind of like, if you're building a house, right?
Okay.
You got to have a solid foundation
Yeah.
before you can start putting up walls and a roof.
Right.
So, Linux is that foundation for Kubernetes.
Got it.
So the stronger your Linux foundation is, the higher you can build your Kubernetes skills.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah,
Okay. So Linux first, Kubernetes later.
I think so. Yeah.
All right, cool. So we've talked about the skills, we've talked about certifications.
Yeah.
What about actually learning this stuff? Like,
Yeah.
where do people go to learn Linux?
Well, this blog post mentioned some really interesting resources.
Yeah, it is.
And one in particular that I kind of get excited about is Linux from scratch.
Linux from scratch.
Have you heard of this one?
I've heard of it. I've never actually like attempted it.
Okay.
But it's basically like you build your own Linux system from the ground up.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a pretty intense project.
Yeah.
But it's a fantastic way to learn like how Linux really works.
Right.
Like all the different components and how they fit together.
So it's not for the faint of heart.
No, definitely not for beginners.
But it's like if you really want to understand Linux, it's like that's the way to do it.
It's the ultimate Linux masterclass.
Okay, so maybe not for day one.
Right.
What about for those of us who are just starting out? Like,
Yep.
what are some good beginner-friendly resources?
Well, they mentioned the book, The Linux Command Line by William Schatz,
Okay.
which is a great place to start.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also a website called Linux Journey, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I've heard of Linux Journey.
It's totally free.
Yeah.
It's interactive. It walks you through everything from the basics to more advanced topics.
So it's a good like step-by-step guide.
Yeah, it's very well structured.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And there's also How Linux Works by Brian Ward.
Oh, yeah. How Linux Works is a great choice, too, if you really want to understand, like, the internals
Right.
of the system, how things operate under the hood.
Okay, so that's for people who want to go a little bit deeper.
A little bit deeper, yeah.
Okay, so we've got books, we've got websites, we've even got the option to build our own operating system.
Yeah,
That's a lot of resources.
it is a lot of resources.
How do people make the most of all this stuff?
I think the key is to find a balance between theory and practice.
Okay.
Reading books and working through tutorials is great for building up your knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
but you really want to get your hands dirty and experiment in
Yeah.
a real environment.
Okay, so like what does that look like in practice?
Well, one of the best things you could do is set up a home lab.
A home lab.
Yeah, even if it's just a virtual one.
Okay.
Spin up a virtual machine, install a Linux distribution like Ubuntu or Fedora, and just start playing around, break things, fix them, experiment with different configurations.
Okay, so don't be afraid to like mess things up
Exactly.
because that's how you learn.
That's how you learn, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
What are some like real world projects that someone could tackle to like really solidify their skills?
Oh, there's tons of possibilities.
Yeah.
You could set up a web server, you could configure user access, you could write automation scripts for backups or deployments.
Okay.
You could even experiment with containerization.
Right.
It really depends on what your interests are
Yeah.
and what you want to achieve.
So it's all about like taking those theoretical skills and putting them to practice.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
So bottom line, how much Linux does someone really need to know to be successful in DevOps?
I don't think you need to be a Linux guru overnight,
Okay.
but having a solid foundation is going to open up so many doors for you in the DevOps world.
Okay, so it's not about like knowing every single command. It's
Yeah.
about like having that core understanding. Exactly.
It's about having that foundation, and then you can build on it from there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up this first part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
Make sure you tune in for part 2, where we're going to go even deeper into some more advanced Linux concepts.
Looking forward to it.
See you there.
Yeah, see you there. Right, welcome back to our deep dive into Linux for DevOps.
We're back and ready to go even deeper.
Yeah, we're moving beyond those basics this time,
Okay.
really getting into some of the more powerful, nuanced aspects of Linux.
All right, I'm excited.
Yeah.
What do we got?
Well, let's talk about the Linux kernel.
The kernel. Okay.
Yeah.
I know that it's like the heart of the operating system.
Right.
But why should someone who's working in DevOps really care about that?
That's a great question. And, you're right. It's more than just knowing that the kernel exists.
Okay.
It's about understanding how the kernel works and how that can impact your work as a DevOps engineer.
Okay, can you give me like a concrete example of that?
Yeah, so let's say you're dealing with a performance bottleneck in your application.
Okay.
Now, if you understand how the kernel works, things like process scheduling, memory management, I/O operations, you can actually diagnose that issue on a much deeper level.
So you're not just like looking at the logs and seeing like, oh, this service is slow.
Right, exactly.
You're like actually understanding like what's happening at the kernel level.
Exactly. You're able to kind of look under the hood and see what's really going on,
Okay.
rather than just treating the system like a black box.
So it's like having that deeper knowledge allows you to troubleshoot those really tricky issues more effectively.
Exactly. And it allows you to optimize performance.
Okay.
Maybe even contribute to open source projects if you're feeling really ambitious.
So where do you even begin with learning about the kernel?
Well, there's some great resources out there. One classic is Understanding the Linux Kernel by Daniel Beauvais and Marco Sassati.
Okay.
It's a bit of a deep dive, but it's packed with insights.
All right, so that's going on the reading list.
Definitely.
But what about other areas where having that deeper Linux knowledge is helpful for DevOps?
Well, let's talk about containerization.
Okay, containers.
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit earlier, but it's such a fundamental part of modern DevOps
Right.
that it deserves a closer look.
Yeah, everyone's talking about containers these days.
They're everywhere. Docker, Kubernetes.
So how does Linux fit into all of that?
Well, we talked about how containers rely heavily on features like type groups and namespaces, which come from the Linux kernel.
Okay.
But it goes beyond that, understanding how container runtimes interact with the kernel,
Okay.
how resources are isolated and manage the security implications of all of that.
Right.
That's where your Linux knowledge becomes really valuable.
So it's not just about like knowing how to build and deploy a container.
Right.
It's about like understanding how it actually works at that lower level.
Exactly. It's about understanding the underlying mechanisms. And that allows you to troubleshoot more effectively, to make better decisions about resource allocation, to ensure that your containerized applications are secure.
Okay, so it sounds like the more you understand about Linux, the more effective you can be with these tools that are kind of like shaping the DevOps world these days.
Absolutely. It's like having a secret weapon.
Yeah. Okay, so how does someone stay motivated with all of this learning? Because it seems like a lot.
It is a lot.
Yeah.
The world of Linux is vast.
Yeah.
And it can definitely feel overwhelming at times.
Right.
I think the key is to break your learning down into manageable chunks.
Okay.
Focus on the areas that are most relevant to your work, and most importantly, find ways to make it fun.
Fun with Linux? Is that even possible?
I know it might sound strange.
Oh, wait.
Linux can actually be really enjoyable to learn.
Yeah, okay.
There's a huge sense of accomplishment that comes from mastering those new commands.
Okay.
Figuring out how to solve complex problems.
Right.
Automating tasks that used to take you forever. And don't forget about the amazing Linux community.
Yeah, the community is great.
There are so many helpful and supportive people out there who are always willing to share their knowledge and experience.
Right.
So you're never really alone on this journey.
Yeah, it's like a global network of mentors and friends who are all passionate about the same thing.
Exactly.
So what are some specific strategies or techniques that people can use to make their learning stick?
Well, one of the best ways to learn is by doing, set up a virtual machine, install a Linux distribution like Ubuntu or Fedora, and just start exploring.
Okay.
Break things, fix them, experiment with different configurations.
Don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how you learn.
All right. So like really get your hands dirty.
Exactly.
And I know we talked about Linux from scratch, which is like the ultimate hands-on project.
It is.
But what about for those of us who aren't ready to build our own operating systems?
Right.
What are some other practical ways to practice?
Well, you could contribute to open source projects.
Okay.
You could write scripts to automate your daily tasks. You could set up a personal web server.
Okay.
You could even build a small cluster using tools like Kubernetes or Docker Swarm.
Wow.
The possibilities are really endless.
So it's all about finding something that you're interested in
Yeah.
and then using that as a way to practice your skills.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then you can share what you've learned with others.
Oh, yeah.
Write blog posts, create tutorials,
Okay.
answer questions on forums.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching is one of the best ways to learn, after all.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot in this part too.
We have.
We've talked about the kernel, we've talked about containerization, we've talked about staying motivated, we've talked about hands-on learning.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I kind of want to bring it back to something you mentioned earlier, which is this idea of Like Linux as a journey.
It is a journey. It's not a destination. It's a continuous process of learning and exploration.
Yeah. So how do people kind of embrace that mindset?
I think it's about staying curious.
Oh.
It's about being willing to experiment, to try new things, to not be afraid of making mistakes.
Yeah.
And it's about connecting with other people who are on that same journey.
Right. So join the community.
Join the community, exactly.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up part 2 of our deep dive.
Yeah.
Make sure you tune in for part 3, where we're going to go even further beyond the basics.
I'm looking forward to it.
See you then. All right. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah, part 3.
Part 3. It's the final countdown.
The grand finale.
We've talked about a lot of Linux stuff.
Yeah, we have.
Essential skills. We've gotten into the kernel a little bit, containerization. But in this final part, I want to know, like, how do we go from just competent Linux users to, like, Linux masters?
Okay, that's a great goal. And I think that's where we start to move beyond just memorizing commands and passing certifications.
Okay.
It's really about understanding the mindset, the philosophy almost,
Okay.
the guiding principles that separate those who truly excel with Linux.
So we're going from, like, the what to the why.
Exactly, yeah.
From, like, the tools to the principles.
Right.
Okay. I like this. I'm ready to have my mind blown.
All right, let's see if we can do that.
Where do we begin?
Well, let's start with a concept that I think is very deeply ingrained in the Linux world,
Okay.
and that's the power of the command line.
Command line. Yeah, we've talked about that.
Yeah, we've talked about it in terms of its efficiency, its precision, but I think there's something deeper there.
Okay.
It's more than just a tool.
Oh.
It's a way of thinking.
How so?
Well, when you interact with your computer through the command line,
Yeah.
you're not just issuing instructions.
Okay.
You're engaging in a dialogue with the system.
Oh.
You're learning its language.
So it's like learning to speak the language of the machine.
Exactly. And that understanding, that fluency, that's what enables you to really troubleshoot effectively,
Okay.
to optimize performance,
Right.
to automate complex tasks with elegance and efficiency.
It's like the difference between just following a recipe
Yeah,
and understanding the chemistry behind cooking.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, like you can follow the steps, but
Yeah.
without that deeper knowledge, you're
Okay.
kind of limited.
Exactly. You're limited in your ability to improvise, to adapt,
Yeah.
to create something truly unique.
And it sounds like that same principle applies to Linux.
Absolutely.
So how do you develop that kind of mindset?
Well, it takes practice.
Okay.
It takes exploration. And I think a big part of it is immersing yourself in the Linux community.
Community. We've talked about that throughout this whole series, but
It's so important.
why is it so crucial?
Because the Linux community is a treasure trove of knowledge and experience. Whether you're browsing online forums, attending local user groups, going to conferences,
Yeah.
there are so many opportunities to connect with other people,
Right.
to ask questions, to share your experiences, and to learn from those who've been there before.
Like having this global network of mentors.
Exactly. And that's something that's really unique to the open source world.
Open source, yeah, that's another big one.
Yeah. The open source movement is about so much more than just free software.
Okay.
It's about transparency, it's about collaboration,
Yeah.
and it's about that shared pursuit of excellence.
And how does that tie into DevOps?
Well, think about all the tools and technologies that are at the heart of DevOps these days.
Okay.
Kubernetes, Docker, Ansible. So many of them are built on the foundation of open source.
Right.
So when you contribute to open source projects,
Yeah.
you're not just giving back to the community, you're deepening your own understanding of how these tools work.
So it's like a win-win.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You learn, you contribute, you become part of something bigger than yourself.
Okay, so as we wrap up this whole deep dive, what's like the one piece of advice you would give to someone who really wants to master Linux?
Embrace the journey.
Embrace the journey.
Don't be afraid to experiment, to break things, to ask questions. Surround yourself with that community.
Yeah.
Contribute to open source projects.
Okay.
And never stop learning.
Never stop learning. All right. That's fantastic advice.
The world of Linux is constantly evolving, so you got to stay curious.
Yeah.
You got to stay hungry for knowledge.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our Linux for DevOps deep dive.
It's been fun.
It has been fun. We've covered a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
I hope you've enjoyed it.
Me too.
If you're watching this and you're feeling inspired
Yeah.
to learn more about Linux,
Absolutely.
definitely go check out some of the resources that we've mentioned.
And don't forget to join that community.
Yeah, the community is awesome.
It is.
All right. Well, until next time.
See you later.
Happy learning.
Keep on hacking.